Okay. Susan Murnane received her BA at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, her JD from the University of Minnesota, and Master of Law and Taxation from Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. She practiced law specializing in tax litigation and white-collar crime at the Tax Division, U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. As an assistant United States attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, Detroit, and in private practice from 1978 to 1995, when she moved to Cleveland and enrolled in the graduate school at Case Western University. She earned her Ph.D. in American history in 2006, specializing in American legal history. In 2014, she published Bankruptcy and an Industrial Society, a history of bankruptcy court for the Northern District of Ohio, Akron University Press. Susan joined the League of Women Voters in 2012. In 2014, she was appointed to the Board of Directors of League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland and to the League of Women Voters U.S. National Study on Money and Politics. She was elected co-president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland in 2016 and served until June 2019. She continues to serve the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland as chair of this historical committee. In May 2019, she was elected to the board of League of Women Voters Ohio. We'll turn it over to Susan. Please, Spike.
I call my presentation Women's Suffrage Human Rights because some suffragists thought of the right to vote as a human right, not all. And that right was foundational to getting and keeping all other rights. And that view was radical when they first expounded it, and it is still radical. It's yet to be fully accepted. The American conception of human rights is, of course, based on Enlightenment philosophy, but only men enjoyed those rights. And voting was not one of those rights. Only a small proportion of the population voted in America at the time of the Revolution. Only a small proportion of men voted at the time of the Revolution. Each colony or state established the qualifications for voting based on property holdings. On the left side, you see it before the Revolutionary War, and on the right are the property holdings on a colony by colony basis after the Revolutionary War. State constitutions were rewritten shortly after the Revolution, almost everywhere, and male suffrage expanded. By the 1920s, something close to universal suffrage, universal white male suffrage, was achieved in the United States. At the time of the Revolution, only householders, independent adult men who owned and managed property, were deemed competent to involve themselves in public affairs or to vote. For a while, some women could and did vote in early federal New Jersey, perhaps 7% of the total votes cast. But the New Jersey Constitution was amended in 1807 to specifically disenfranchise women. Free African American men could qualify to vote in some colonies and in the Northwest Territories before the American Revolution. However, as state constitutions were written and revised in the early federal period to expand white male voting rights, some states also changed their constitutions to explicitly exclude Black men. Slavery was legal everywhere in the North American colonies before the Revolution. The northern states slowly abolished slavery between 1777 and 1817. Some of the emancipation statutes called for a gradual process based on the Pennsylvania statute, where children born after the Emancipation Law passed were freed at maturity. That meant that people living in so-called free states of the antebellum North still lived among slaves almost up to the Civil War in many cases. By the late 1820s, a small but determined abolitionist movement emerged in the northern states. Printer William Lloyd Garrison established the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831, which he published continuously until 1870, after the 15th Amendment was ratified. In 1833, he was a founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society. It advocated for immediate abolition of slavery and quickly attracted state and local affiliates. Societies formed in New England allowed female activists and leadership. This provoked a split in the abolitionist movement in 1839. Garrison, the Liberator, and the American Anti-Slavery Society supported women's rights and disapproved of political activity, claiming it legitimized a corrupt pro-slavery constitution, while the American and foreign Anti-Slavery Society advocated for abolition through the political process, but expected conventional behavior from women. In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband, Henry, spent their honeymoon in London at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott. They were both seated in a special section reserved for women who were not allowed to participate in the meeting. Mott was a very highly respected abolitionist from Philadelphia and had been sent to the London meeting as a delegate, but was still not allowed to participate. Stanton later claimed that she and Mott decided then at the London meeting, Anti-Slavery Society meeting, to hold a women's rights convention when they got back to America. Most of women's legal disabilities arose from coverture, a legal fiction of ancient origin. At marriage, a woman was absorbed into the personhood of her husband. The household had but one spokesperson, and that one head and spokesperson was the husband. All of a married woman's personal property became her husband's property. He could devise it by will, but she could not. She could not even recover it upon his death, except by his will. Her husband had a right even to her wages. A married woman retained legal title to her real property, but her husband had the right to manage the property and to all of its rents and profits. Her husband even had the right to custody of any children by the marriage. Even if he died, he could determine custody of the children in his will. Women had been agitating for more rights for a very long time. This is a brief summary of Ohio's women's rights legislation. In Ohio, women's rights legislation was passed piecemeal between 1821 and 1894. Precedent-setting legislation on married women's property rights finally passed in New York in 1848. Similar legislation wouldn't pass in England until 1882. Women's property rights were a state law issue and passed on a state-by-state basis. And so each state has a different women's rights history. In 1847, Lucy Stone graduated from Oberlin College and lectured on women's rights before accepting a job with Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society as a field worker and traveling lecturer. In October 1851, she became a professional full-time lecturer on women's rights. Many women were able to make a living on the lecture circuit at this time. The women's rights movement was active but not organized. In 1855, Lucy Stone married fellow abolitionist Henry Blackwell and kept her own last name. To this day, women like me who keep their own names after marriage are called Lucy Stoners in some circles. Many conventions on women's suffrage or abolition, sometimes both, occurred between 1848 and the Civil War. The best known was the Seneca Falls Convention in July 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Approximately 300 people attended, including Frederick Douglass, the only African American to attend. 100 people signed the Declaration of Sentiments. The first and only controversial demand in the Declaration was women's suffrage. The rest of the demands concerned women's legal incapacities under coverture, a single woman's taxation without representation, women's inferior legal position with respect to divorce and inheritance, women's inability to secure an education, practice professions, or hold public office, the moral double standard, and the exclusion of women from public life. Many years later, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony would write a history of women's suffrage and use it to claim that the women's rights movement started at Seneca Falls. And they did this in order to secure a narrative to guide future suffragists, a usable past in historians' language. Susan B. Anthony did not attend the Seneca Falls Convention, although she heard of it. Several of her family members attended another women's rights convention in Rochester, New York, which was held a few weeks later to take advantage of Lucretia Mott's visit to the area. Lucretia Mott was a star. Anthony met Stanton at an abolition convention in Seneca Falls in 1851. They liked each other immediately and entered into a lifelong friendship and collaboration. Stanton was an intellectual, interested in political theory and philosophy, and Anthony was a brilliant organizer and strategist. In October 1850, Lucy Stone organized the first National Women's Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. About 1,000 women attended that convention. Annual national conventions took place after that until the Civil War, including one in Cleveland in 1853. After the Civil War, suffragists fought over the true origin of the suffrage movement as a proxy for contesting its meaning. The 1850 Women's Convention in Worcester is the alternative origin to the Seneca Falls Convention. This fight continues today among historians and women's rights activists. Seneca Falls stands for single-minded dedication to the goal of women's suffrage, damn the collateral damage, while Worcester represents moral purity in the suffrage fight and a commitment to racial justice. Between 1861 and 1865, suffrage work was suspended for Civil War work. Some women's rights activists served as nurses, like Clara Barton, and many worked with the United States Sanitary Commission, a large national volunteer association that raised money and sent supplies to Union soldiers. On May 14, 1863, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony established the Women's Loyal National League to prove women's commitment to the war effort. They obtained more than 400,000 signatures on a petition demanding congressional legislation for the immediate end of slavery. The petition was submitted in February 1864. They also raised money to support Harriet Tubman's work during the war. In addition to leading slaves to Union lines, to freedom and Union lines, Tubman worked as a Union spy. On May 10, 1866, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Martha Coffin Pelham Wright, who was Lucretia Mott's sister, and Ernestine Rose established the American Equal Rights Association to promote and secure, this is important, equal rights to all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex. Ernestine Rose may be the most important suffragist that nobody ever heard of. She was extremely important in reform of the New York Married Women's Property Acts and in outreach to the Midwestern immigrant community. Unlike most American-born suffragists, she spoke both French and German, and there were a lot of German immigrants, particularly in the Midwest. Lucy Stone was the AERA's was on the AERA's executive committee. The AERA was integrated by both race and gender, and it included both abolitionists and women's rights activists, but uncomfortably. Most abolitionist men did not support women's rights. AERA's goal of universal suffrage and equal rights was doomed by the politics of the 15th Amendment. The amendment was an affirmative step backward for women's rights. I've highlighted where it mentions male inhabitants and male citizens. This is the first place in the Constitution where gender is used as a qualifier. The Stanton, Anthony, and Rose thought that it implied that citizenship was limited to males. Abolitionists and Republican men asked suffragists to support a 15th Amendment that would not bring universal suffrage, that only enfranchised Black men. They called it the Negro's Hour, and argued that Black male suffrage was necessary to protect the gains of the Civil War and to allow Black men to protect themselves from violence. They claimed that adding women's suffrage did not help achieve those goals and would make it more difficult for passage of Black male suffrage. They promised it would be women's turn for suffrage at some indefinite time in the future. All the suffragists were angry, but some more than others. Stanton and Anthony were outraged. The 15th Amendment passed Congress in February of 1869. In May of 1869, the American Equal Rights Association voted to support the 15th Amendment. Stanton and Anthony were deeply offended. They had worked long and hard for abolition and universal suffrage, and they felt they had been thrown under the bus. On May 15, 1869, Stanton and Anthony founded the National Woman Suffrage Association. It did not support the 15th Amendment and committed itself to a 16th Amendment enfranchising women. In November 1869, Lucy Stone founded the American Woman Suffrage Association, which supported the 15th Amendment and vowed to work for women's suffrage state by state. On February 3, 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, and it provided that citizens may not be denied the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but the amendment left the door open for disenfranchisement on other grounds, such as literacy, or poll taxes, or by intimidation. And we all know how that turned out. The NWSA and AWSA were separated by more than the 15th Amendment. They were separated by legal and governmental philosophy as well. The NWSA believed that the 14th Amendment made the national government, not the states, the arbiter of citizenship. And they wanted a national woman suffrage amendment, separate and apart from questions of equal rights and manhood suffrage. Before the Civil War, the states alone had determined voting rights and citizenship. And the American Woman Suffrage Association did not believe that the 14th Amendment had changed that. They believed that it was necessary to seek suffrage on a state-by-state basis. Also, the American Women's Suffrage Association was more conservative in its views on the appropriate roles of women in society and the extent to which the state had a legitimate interest in regulating women's behavior. Lucy Stone launched their newspaper, the Woman's Journal, which became the primary source of information on women's suffrage from 1870 to 1917. The women's suffrage movement was split between these two national organizations for 30 years. State and local suffrage associations flourished, though most declined to associate with one or the other national organization. The split in the movement was highly unpopular. Suffrage activity had no central strategy and little success. In 1878, A women's suffrage amendment was introduced into Congress, but it got nowhere. Women's suffrage amendments, called Susan Anthony amendments, were introduced every year after that for 40 years, but did not get anywhere. A state-by-state strategy was also unsuccessful. By 1890, no states allowed women to vote except Wyoming, which had allowed women to vote since 1869 when it was still a territory. The territory of Utah allowed women to vote in 1870, lost it in 1887 by an act of Congress, but got it restored in 1896. The territory of Washington and Montana also allowed women's suffrage. But no states other than Wyoming after it became state. Lucy Stone was ill and didn't want to continue the American Women's Suffrage Association. And Stanton had become bored with suffrage. She was a free thinker and now believed religion was the principal obstacle to women's equality, not suffrage. In February 1890, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association merged and became one organization, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Technically, Lucy Stone was board chair and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was president, Susan B. Anthony vice president. But Stanton and Stone retired quickly, and Susan B. Anthony ran the organization until her retirement in 1900. Anthony immediately declared all state organizations to be affiliates of the NAWSA, which some state organizations didn't like. But finally, her energy and strategic skills had an adequate field for action. It was the age of organizations, and other women's organizations became part of the broad suffrage coalition. Two of the most important national organizations were, first, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, run by Frances Willard. Founded in 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was the largest women's organization of the 19th century. It considered temperance a woman's rights issue based on religion and the culture of domesticity. Stanton hated it as a result. Did I mention Stanton was also into free love? Anthony was an old friend of Frances Willard's and had no problem working with her, admired her organizational skills. The Women's Christian Temperance Union's support of suffrage, however, became a major obstacle to winning suffrage elections. The liquor industry was huge and very popular with men who feared that women would pass prohibition if given the vote, something which the WCTU encouraged them to think. She encouraged women to go for suffrage in order to pass prohibition. The National Association of Colored Women was co-founded by Mary Church Terrell in 1896 with Frances Ellen Walker Harper, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Harriet Tubman. With the motto, "Lifting as we climb," the organization was dedicated to improving opportunities for African American women and suffrage. The NAWSA did not prohibit Black membership, but it allowed state and local chapters to do so if they chose. NAWSA also allowed African American societies to formally affiliate, which was useful when the state or local organization was segregated, which it usually was in the South. As the NAWSA pushed for final passage of the 19th Amendment in the early 20th century, it capitulated to white prejudice and prohibited affiliations with African American suffrage societies. So unless you were in a northern state where you were allowed membership in the NAWSA, African American women were excluded from the principal suffrage organization towards the end. Terrell was a suffragist since her time at Oberlin. She went to college at Oberlin College. Her parents sent her up to Oberlin for high school to get a better education. And she was driven to activism in the 1890s by the rise in racial violence and Jim Crow laws. Although significant numbers of African American men voted after ratification of the 15th Amendment for a couple of decades and had significant success in being elected to office, by 1900, almost no African American men were still registered to vote. Despite the 14th and 15th Amendments, the federal government declined to, as they put it, intervene in the internal affairs of the southern states to enforce African American civil rights, including voting rights. Support for women's suffrage was very weak in the South. The South was more culturally conservative, of course. But just as important, white supremacists feared that women's suffrage would reopen the question of federal authority to enforce civil rights for African Americans, including African American men. They also feared that they could not get away with committing the kind of violence against Black women that they did against Black men. It would look too bad, and it might weaken Northern willingness to let them handle, as they put it, their race problems in their own way. Despite suffragist attempts to win Southern support through complicity with white supremacy, suffragists never won significant Southern support. Now we're going to switch to Ohio, because as you reach the end of the suffrage struggle, it becomes very much a state-by-state battle. And you would have to every state has its own story. And since we're in Ohio, and I've happened to learn something about the Ohio fight, that's where we're going to go next. The center of suffrage activity in Ohio was Warren, where Harriet Taylor Upton lived. Raised in Ohio, Harriet Taylor Upton moved to Washington when her father was elected to Congress in 1880. There she met Susan B. Anthony and converted to suffragism. Upton returned to Warren, joined her local suffrage society. In 1890, Upton joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and in 1894, she was elected the NAWSA treasurer. She served until 1910. At her request, she was so important that the NAWSA relocated its headquarters to Warren, Ohio, from 1903 to 1910. She also served as president of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association from 1899 to 1908 and from 1911 to 1920. In 1894, Ohio passed legislation allowing women to vote in school board elections and to serve on school boards concurrently. And in 1898, Upton became the first woman from Warren to serve on the school board. Elizabeth J. Hauser is my favorite suffragist. She was born in Girard, Ohio, of German immigrants. She joined the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association when she was 16. She worked as a journalist right out of high school, and while writing for the Warren Tribune Chronicle, Hauser met Harriet Taylor Upton and other national suffragists. In 1895, Hauser became press secretary for NAWSA and the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association. In 1909, she moved to New York City as vice chairman of the NAWSA Press Committee, and in 1910, she returned to Cleveland when the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association appointed her to lead the suffrage campaign in Cleveland. And you might note that she's also probably not the editor so much as the author of Cleveland Mayor Tom Johnson's memoirs. Hauser was brought back to Cleveland to run the first really organized campaign in Ohio for women's suffrage. A constitutional convention was called for January 1912, and Ohio suffragists wanted to make sure that the commissioners would support women's suffrage. Elizabeth Hauser reorganized Cleveland's suffrage organization into the Women's Suffrage Party. And in order to increase the visibility and acceptability of suffrage, she recruited leading socialites like Zara DuPont, Lucia McCurdy McBride, Belle Sherwin, Minerva Brooks, and Edna Brush Perkins. They became formative players in Ohio's suffrage movement and founders of the League of Women Voters. There's their headquarters. And an interesting thing, the history of the League of Women Voters and suffrage in Ohio, which they published in 1945, the suffragists who remembered, say that if you notice the women turning their backs, that women were afraid, did not want to be photographed, memorialized, that the suffrage movement profoundly changed these women's relationships to public appearances. A soon-to-be progressive Mayor Newton Baker and spouses of these socialite suffragists formed the Ohio Men's League for Suffrage. Competing socialists formed an anti-suffrage league. The antis, if you can, just kind of notice the names. If you're Cleveland natives, you'll recognize who all of these anti-suffrage women run down this column. The antis argued that woman is not being deprived of a right because she is not allowed to vote. Suffrage is not a natural or an inherent right of the individual. The Constitutional Convention met on January 1, and on May 31, it approved a women's suffrage amendment. This convention was a major restructuring of the 1851 Constitution to make it better serve Ohio's emerging urban industrial world. There were a total of 42 amendments set for the special election on September 3rd. Suffragists mobilized using parades and open-air speaking and door-to-door canvassing, the enrollment of pledges of individual support. This slide is Cleveland's prize-winning float in the big parade in Columbus in 1912. This campaign really organized the suffrage movement. You've got Belle Sherwin on the left, Maud Wood Park on the right. Maud Wood Park formed the College Equal Suffrage League in 1900 when she was a college girl and went to an NAWSA meeting and found only old ladies there. That was the last NAWSA meeting that Susan Anthony chaired before her retirement. Park came to Cleveland to help with the suffrage campaign in 1912. She would later head the NAWSA Congressional Committee, head lobbyist, and was the first president of the League of Women Voters of the U.S. Belle Sherwin was a leading Cleveland social reformer and philanthropist, and one of those socialites Elizabeth Hauser recruited in 1910. She became involved in suffrage in 1910 and was the first president of the League of Women Voters of Cleveland and the second president of the League of Women Voters of the United States. Florence Allen comes into the picture at this point in time also. She was born in Utah, but came to Cleveland to attend Western Reserve University. It did not admit women to its law school. So Allen left for the University of Chicago in 1909 and then entered the NYU Law School. Florence Allen supported herself as secretary to Maud Wood Park while she studied at NYU and came to Cleveland after law school let out the summer of 1912 to participate in the suffrage campaign. She graduated from NYU cum laude in June 1913 and returned to Cleveland, where her legal skills proved very useful in the suffrage movement, as we shall see in a few more slides. Voters passed most of the Ohio constitutional amendments, but woman suffrage was rejected. Also rejected was an amendment to eliminate the word white from the definition of persons entitled to vote. Even though the 15th Amendment, granting Black male suffrage, made the provision inoperative, the Ohio Constitution still limited the right to vote by its terms to white male citizens. So, the second campaign for women's suffrage started immediately upon the end of the first campaign for women's suffrage in Ohio. One of the 1912 constitutional amendments that passed authorized voter-initiated referendum. So suffragists planned a referendum on women's suffrage for the 1914 general election. Similar tactics to the 1912 election were used. Parades, speeches, canvassing. You can tell this is a parade in Cleveland because of the Packard signs and streets. In March 1914, the first petitions were sent out. 130,000 signatures from a majority of Ohio counties were needed to put the suffrage amendment on the November 1914 ballot. The petitions were submitted on July 30, 1914. In August 1914, the Guns of August, World War I broke out in Europe. Nevertheless, the suffragists decided to go forward with their parade on October 3rd. Over 10,000 women marched. Unfortunately, the suffrage amendment was defeated at the November ballot anyway. So, third campaign for women's suffrage in Ohio, they changed tactics again. Frustrated by the slow progress towards suffrage nationally, in 1915, the NAWSA decided to bring Carrie Chapman back as president. Cat had previously been president for 4 years immediately after Susan B. Anthony retired. She was replaced by Anna Howard Shaw, whom she replaced in turn. In 1914, Cat unveiled what she called the winning plan, getting some kind of suffrage in enough states to force enactment of a national amendment. They wouldn't decide between getting a national amendment or a state strategy or a national strategy. They'd go for both. Following this strategy, Ohio suffragists launched their third campaign for suffrage by pursuing legislation to allow women to vote in presidential elections. This was called presidential suffrage. It was based on the theory that the US Constitution left the selection of presidential electors completely up to the state legislatures. So legislatures could enable women to vote for president, just president, not congressmen, not senators, not state representatives, just president, without going through a state constitutional amendment. Other suffragists lobbied Ohio suffragists lobbied the Ohio legislature, and on February 21, 1917, presidential suffrage passed, was signed into law. However, on March 31, the Ohio Attorney General gave anti-suffragists 90 days to file signatures to overturn presidential suffrage. The suffragists thought many of these signatures were fraudulent and sued to challenge the validity of the anti-presidential suffrage petitions. Their litigation was dismissed by the Ohio Supreme Court on October 23rd on the grounds that it was too close to the election. With no time to mount a statewide defense, the anti-presidential suffrage referendum prevailed at the November election, and the suffragists lost again. Ohio suffragists also pursued municipal suffrage, allowing women to chartered municipalities to vote in municipal elections. It was similar to the presidential suffrage theory, in that since the 1912 constitutions allowed city charters as a matter of local petition, that the city charters could then authorize women to vote in those elections without having to go through a constitutional amendment to change their voting status. Florence Allen convinced East Cleveland that a city charter provision granting women municipal suffrage would be constitutional, and on June 6, East Cleveland adopted a new city charter granting women municipal suffrage. Opponents sued. Florence Allen represented the Women's Suffrage Party of Cleveland in the litigation, and in April 1917, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld East Cleveland's charter granting women municipal suffrage. Following this precedent, Lakewood sued for municipal suffrage for women under their city charter at the November 17. Lakewood voted for municipal suffrage for women under their city charter at the November 1917 election and won. The final push The United States entered World War I on April 6, 1917. Suffragists were divided over whether to support war work or to engage in militant actions demanding women's suffrage. In Washington, D.C., Alice Paul decided for militancy and formed the National Women's Party. Members protested daily in front of the White House, demanding democracy for American women, and endured jail under abominable conditions to prove their devotion to principle. In Cleveland, Belle Sherwin and Lucia McCurdy McBride embraced war work to prove the justice of women's suffrage, that women were deserving citizens. Belle Sherwin served as Women's Committee Chair for the Ohio branch of the Council of National Defense. Finally, in September 1917, the U.S. House of Representatives formed a women's suffrage committee, and President Wilson declared his support for a women's suffrage amendment in November. In January 1918, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was defeated in the Senate by 1 vote. It was defeated in the Senate again in October, this time by 2 votes. Ohio suffragists concentrated their efforts on electing legislators who supported women's suffrage at the November election, and they were successful. In a special session of the new Congress, the Susan Anthony Amendment passed by a comfortable margin in the House of Representatives on May 20th. It passed the Senate by 2 votes on June 4. On June 16, Ohio became the 5th state to ratify the amendment by an overwhelming margin. It is sometimes said, well, women didn't really need the 19th Amendment because look at all the states where they already had the vote. But take a close look at this map. This is where suffrage stood on the eve of ratification of the 36th necessary state in August 1920. Only 2 states east of the Mississippi gave women full suffrage, New York and Michigan, and both of those states achieved suffrage as part of the Women Winning Plan push. Presidential suffrage was achieved in several other states, including Ohio, as well, not in Ohio. In Ohio, it was right on the eve of ratification that they got presidential suffrage. But that also came through as part of the winning campaign. And it didn't really grant representation. It didn't give you anything in Congress or in the state legislatures. A few states had really limited suffrage, like Texas, you could only vote in primaries, and at that time you probably had the white primaries. So maybe that was important, if you were, that was the election where the real action was. And then you have in Louisiana and a few other states, New Mexico, Mississippi, you could vote in property tax elections. But only the West was open to suffrage. And at that point in time, there really weren't that many people in the West. Tennessee, over here, right, August 18, 1920, became the 36th state to pass the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920. And it was certified on August 26. A lot of people, even League of Women Voters members, often act as though passage were inevitable. But I am not so sure that women would have gotten the vote anytime soon if it hadn't happened in August 1920. Where would the last votes have come from? Look at the states after Tennessee in August 1920. Maybe Connecticut would have come through. All of the other states came later, some of them much later. You have Delaware in 1923, then it's in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. French women did not get the vote until after the Civil War. Swiss women did not get the vote until the 1970s. The women in Quebec did not get the vote until the 1940s. I am not so certain that we would have gotten the vote until the 1960s here in America. You may recall that the Civil Rights Act of 1965, women were included as part of what one Southern legislature thought would be a poison pill. Oh, well, let's put women in there too, and then people wouldn't vote for it. It was sort of accidental. But we did get it, and in August 20. And the other thing I want you to look at is which states voted. You'll notice that with the exception of Connecticut, every state after that was a slaveholding state at the time of the Civil War. And I don't know if you can see where it says second vote. That means they'd already voted once and declined to pass the amendment. So I think people are a little too confident that it would have come then. I'm not at all that certain myself. But the suffragists had faith. This is the first League of Women Voters of the U.S. board. Before the amendment was ratified, in February 14, 1920, the League of Women Voters was founded at the final meeting of the NAWSA. This was Carrie Katz's idea. She felt that when women got the vote, they would need an organization to help them to use the vote intelligently. So she founded the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters of Cleveland was founded that summer on May 29th, 1920. Belle Sherwin was its first president. Its stated purpose was and is twofold: to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information to voters on candidates, elections, government processes, and the important issues of the day, and secondly, to support good government legislation and public policy reforms. The League still does all these things. In 1920, the Cleveland League of Women Voters initiated printer voter guides. They asked candidates questions about their positions on issues, and then printed flyers where voters could compare the candidates side by side on the same issues. This was hugely popular. They also staged candidate forums in the neighborhoods where candidates for the same office appeared before voters on the same stage to answer the same questions. When Belle Sherwin became president of the League of Women Voters US, these programs went national. And today, the League of Women Voters is still known for doing voter guides and candidate forums. Today, our voter guides are done digitally. We have a nationwide online voter guide called Vote 411. Just type your address in and your ballot will come up and you can see all your candidates and issues. I encourage you to use it. But the League of Women Voters' impact has been broader than voter education. The suffrage amendment brought women out of their homes and into public sphere, and we stayed there. The suffragists became skilled political operators, lobbyists, researchers, activists, and organizers. They wanted all women to be effective in politics, and the League of Women Voters was their instrument to teach more women the ropes. It remains an effective vehicle for increasing women's political power and influence. Women voted in droves in the 1920 election. This chart was produced by Barbara Palmer, a League member and a political science professor at John Carroll University. Because there were no reliable exit polls at that time, there's no direct way to know the female vote in 1920. So Barb compared the statewide vote for governor before and after ratification of the 19th Amendment. And you'll see it exploded. In the early 20th century, Ohio governors served 2-year terms. When looking at this table, keep in mind that turnout in presidential years, 1916, 1920, 1924, was and is always higher than in midterm years. In the 1920 election, Florence Allen was elected to the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. Once women became active, they started running for office as well. Oops. Other Ohio women were elected to office immediately. Some were elected to the school board, the only office to which they could be elected before 1920. Florence Allen was able to launch a run for Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas after the August ratification for the November election because she was so well known, and she won. In the 1922 election, Allen won election to the Ohio Supreme Court. She became the first female elected to a state Supreme Court in the United States. 6 women were elected to the Ohio legislature in the November 1921 elections, 4 to the House of Representatives and 2 to the Senate. Mary B. Grossman was admitted to the Ohio bar in 1912 and was the 3rd woman to practice law in Cleveland. She ran unsuccessfully for municipal judge in 1921, and in 1923 she was elected, the first woman elected to a municipal judgeship in the United States. She was elected repeatedly and served for 36 years. And women have continued to achieve leadership positions throughout government and the professions with increasing frequency since 1920. Although we have not yet reached parity, we continue to seek and obtain leadership positions. So thank you. Thank you. That's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Susan. It was so interesting. I have a question from Spike. He wanted to know, he noted that everything described has been organized and nonviolent. Were there cases of riots and strikes or other non-peaceful efforts? He also wondered if Belle Sherwin was the Sherwin of the Sherwin-Williams company.
She sure is. Belle was a daughter of the Sherwin family that started Sherwin-Williams Company. The women were subjected to violence. I'm not aware of any violence which they initiated, particularly the parade in 1913 in Washington, D.C., which was run by Alice Paul. It was a very big parade, suffrage parade. The police did not do a good job of crowd control, and the marchers were assaulted by the crowd. And I think that happened in other circumstances. Women were, in the early days, were frequently assaulted when they would be giving speeches. Things would be thrown at them. But I don't believe that I have no knowledge of their ever engaging in violence themselves.
I was curious about the fact that Mississippi didn't pass the 19th Amendment until 1984. What was the point? Like, was it just so that they could go on record as having passed it, or and what a humiliation, really? I
have no idea. I think it just finally became embarrassing. Some Mississippi women just finally decided that this has to happen. Mississippi.
Another question. Where did the financial support come from for this suffrage movement?
Another advantage of recruiting rich women. You know, a lot of their, they had resources themselves. They could afford to not work and to donate money. There were fund drives. There was a lot of popular support. The NAWSA, when it became active about 1916, had more than 2 million members. So if each woman just gave a little bit. The book on the history of the Cleveland League of Women Voters and Suffrage in Cuyahoga County talked about endless fundraising. This was, of course, written primarily by the society women who later became key leaguers, and they claimed that they would not take their husband's money, and so they did bake sales and la-di-da, but I'm sure they had enough money of their own. There would have been, I honestly don't know where they got money beyond that. A lot of it was done on shoestring. The league runs a lot on a shoestring. We do mostly volunteer labor. You know, we have almost no paid staff, almost no paid organizers.
Right. So another question, if Mississippi didn't pass women's suffrage until 1984, does that mean that they couldn't vote in the presidential elections until then?
No, that's the beauty of the national amendment. You know, once it's just as black men could vote in Ohio, despite the Constitution limiting suffrage to white males, women could vote in Mississippi. I don't know if they did that much, because you do also have, the culture of ladyhood, but they could if they wanted to, and I'm sure many did.
Interesting. How many women have voted over the years, and which party in 1920? I'm not sure I understand that question. What was the pattern been since then? Oh, so maybe I think it's from Spike. He's asking about the percentages of women overall that vote compared to men, perhaps, and which party were they in the 1920s?
In the 1920s, you had women in both parties. I think I can't prove this, but I think they're just anecdotally having noticed who went on to work in political parties or to support candidates, because these women work in politics as well as in the League of Women Voters, which is, of course, nonpartisan. I think there was a predominance of Republican women initially. I think voting wore off after a while. Initially, you have these huge numbers of women voting, it looks like, based on Barb's numbers. But I think as years went on, women voted less. Since the 1980s, however, women have voted more regularly than men. And since about the 1980s, women have started to become more democratic. I don't know how women voted before that. I've not seen any numbers on that. Some of you may recall, as I do, that before the 1960s, before the second wave feminism, and an early second wave feminism, a lot of women's rights was really viewed as a rich woman's problem, as a Republican woman's problem. The Democratic Party was more focused on trying to make sure that working men had a living wage so their wives could stay home and take care of their kids and not have to work outside the home. So their wives could live more like Republican wives. It was really the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the anti-Vietnam War movement, which brought about second wave feminism, where women really got tired of being treated as decorative objects, as sexual partners, as coffee makers, and organized for their own power.
Interesting. Any idea about the projected women's vote for the Biden-Harris ticket? Do you think a presence of a woman as a vice president is going to energize perhaps a women's vote, or not necessarily?
No, it's really hard to tell. Hillary Clinton did not energize the women's vote as much as one would have thought.
Right.
It's a majority of white women voted for Donald Trump. We need to. Not all women are independent or want to be independent. There are women who want to be Cinderella and taken care of, and somehow think that they can be. And so it's really hard to tell. I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, we will find out.
Wow.
Soon enough. Good. Well, I think we'll leave it at that. We want to thank you so much for an excellent, interesting, timely talk, and something that hopefully will energize everybody, not just women. And thank you so much. And I guess any comments, Jim, before we wrap up? I don't know if Jim is still here.
Mute, Jim.
Jim, you're muted.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. When at the beginning of your talk, you talked about slavery becoming illegal in the North, but the Northern banks financed the slave-holding mortgages the 1830s and 40s. When did that become illegal?
Well, that wouldn't have been illegal as long as slavery was legal in the South, because they're financing property in the place where it's property. So that would not have been illegal.
Okay.
That's part of your the house divided against itself. The problem of slaves moving through a place. The Dred Scott issue. If you're a free state, if somebody can travel, if a white citizen has the right to travel through all of the states and bring his property with him, why can't he bring his slaves with him? But if he can bring his slaves with him, how long can he stay? Can he stay for years? I mean, if I could go and visit my grandmother for many years and bring my property with me. But if you can bring slaves with you, how do you stay a free state? If they can live there as slaves. So I mean, that was the problem of having a split society, is that it's hard to draw those lines.
I have another question, which is much broader, but I'm sort of wading through the types of mankind printed in the 1855, the research by Morton in the 1830s and 40s, skull size, which then led to racism and what were eugenics and all that.
Yeah.
Well, coincidentally, these two things happening together.
Hey, Jim, I think we probably should wrap up, but if you'd like, I could put you in a breakout room with Susan so you can ask questions specifically. So I'm going to do the breakout rooms like we had before, so you can leave if you want to, or if you'd like to visit with other JSC members that you haven't talked to, you'll be able to do it in smaller groups. So thank you, Susan. That was a very good program, and I hope you'll stick around for the breakout rooms.
Well, I sure will. I want to continue the discussion with Jim.
Thank you so much.
And your cat.